All right. It is time for our fourth finalist. Last but certainly not least, Catholic Relief Services, along with their partners Lumos and Maestral International, are dedicated to changing the way we care. Families, they will remind you, are the original Department of Health, the Department of Education, Department of Welfare. In their absence, governments and civil societies try to fill the void, often with orphanages. But it's never enough. Nothing can replace the love of a family. Globally, many children in orphanages have a living parent, the vast majority, in fact. The next project is about strengthening these families. It's about connecting children to the services that they need. And it's about creating a culture where children never need to grow up in an orphanage. And it's about doing all of this at a global scale. So welcome Changing the Way We Care from Catholic Relief Services, Shannon Senefeld, from Maestral International, Philip Goldman, and from Lumos, Georgette Mulheir.
Eight million children around the world live in orphanages today. The devastating reality is that the majority of those children actually have a living parent. 80 to 90% of children living in orphanages have a parent who is alive, who loves them, most of whom would be happy to take care of them. Unfortunately, many parents make a devastating decision. They have to choose between keeping their child with them at home within their families or placing them in an orphanage where they're often told that the child will have access to education, health care, and other services that the families themselves are too impoverished to provide. It's a devastating decision that no parent should have to make, and many children are suffering the consequences. Stephen is one of those children.
Stephen Wusembe was only 5 years old when his mother tragically passed away. That didn't make him an orphan. His father was still alive and living in Kenya, but incapable of caring for him. So the decision was made to place Stephen in an orphanage. He wouldn't leave that orphanage for almost 14 years. Now, I want you to imagine, you're 5 years old, you've just gone through the most traumatic loss imaginable, the loss of your mother. And now you've been thrust into a building with 50 children that you've never met before. And there are 4 adult staff running around barking orders at you. They don't have a minute for the needs of you or the other children. And it's a dangerous place. The place is rife with abuse. The older children prey on the younger and the weak. But there's a time each day in the afternoon when it's worst of all. The staff leave, they take out their keys, and they lock the children in on their own for 2 terrifying, unimaginable hours until the night shift arrived. This was Stephen's childhood. And when he was 18, he was turned out of the orphanage and given an envelope with $100 and told to make his way. Imagine standing on the steps of that orphanage, the Kenyan hot and dusty street in front of you with no friends to turn to, no family to call. Which direction do you go? Stephen asked us to share this story with you today. But Stephen is not alone, is he, George?
No, there are many Stephens in the world, and there are also children like Victoria, who was born in Moldova in 1997, at a time when the country was struggling to become an independent democracy after decades of dictatorship. Victoria's family was struggling with the fact that their beautiful daughter had been born with a disability, and the state authorities were pressuring them to put her into an institution. They refused. And they raised Victoria at home where she was loved and cherished until the age of 7, when her parents were given an impossible choice. They were told that if they wanted Victoria to have an education, the only way that could happen was to send her away to a residential special school 100 miles from home, because there was no inclusive education for children with disabilities in her community. Victoria's parents made that choice because they didn't want to deny her a future. And Victoria says that she was terrified in the institution, that for the first year, she missed home so desperately that she cried every single day. But gradually, she got used to being away from home and in the institution. And after 5 years, she felt more like she was the institution's child rather than her parents' daughter.
Stephen and Victoria sadly are not alone. There are 8 million children right now living in orphanages around the world. 8 million. That's about the size of the population of the greater metropolitan area of Chicago. Imagine the ripple effect of being in these orphanages, what that does to your future relationships. They're deprived of their family's love and their communities on a daily basis. In the future, this will affect every relationship they have. Imagine their relationships with their wives, their husbands, their future children. All of those relationships will be harmed by their orphanage experience. And the 8 million children currently in orphanages quickly will spread and affect many, many more. If each of them has 10 relationships, the 8 million people currently affected by the negative situation of orphanages blooms to 80 million people negatively affected. Why? Philip will show us what life is really like in an orphanage.
So 25 years ago, I visited my first orphanage. It was one of those big Soviet institutions that housed hundreds of children. Now I want you to imagine that you were with me that day, and let's walk in together. It's dark, and your eyes begin to adjust. And you start to see children in the shadows. And you immediately notice that there's something terribly wrong. They're emaciated, malnourished, and that's part of it. Their skin is sallow, yellowed, as if they haven't been outside at all, and in fact, they weren't allowed outside at this particular orphanage. But it's something else that really strikes you. It's like these children haven't grown into their bodies. They aren't right for their ages. Their development has taken some terrible trajectory that you have difficulty grasping at first. And then something else happens. The children rush you. They surround you, they hug you, the smaller ones jump in your arms. At first, that's very sweet, but there's something wrong with that as well. There's no stranger danger here. A completely unknown adult like myself walks in, and these children crave touch. And a stranger provides an opportunity for contact that they don't get in their regular day. So now let's round the corner together, and we go into a big hall. And this hall is full of cribs. But this isn't a baby home. This is a home for older children. The cribs are filled with children up to their teens. Many of these children are with disability, a rather wide spectrum. Some of them are restrained in the cribs, and you watch them and you watch the staff. The staff really have two jobs, and that is to feed these children on a regular set routine and to change them on a set routine as well. That was all these children with such exceptional needs were receiving throughout their day. And in the orphanages we work in, 40 to 60% of the children that we meet are with disability. That day, I saw the most marginalized and vulnerable children I had ever seen in my life. And they had been completely hidden in these institutions. In fact, for the last 25 years, they've been largely hidden. And this MacArthur 100&Change process is the first time we've seen a huge spotlight put on them. That day, 25 years ago, my life changed forever. Now let's travel to Romania together. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project is a longitudinal study that is actually one of the seminal studies in the effects of toxic stress on children. It was conducted in an orphanage that was actually much worse than the one that I just described. Here in this orphanage, we saw 2 to 3 children in a crib, and those cribs crammed into rooms, the children subjected to the most amazing neglect and deprivation on every measure. Now, I want you to look at this first picture coming up and tell me how old you think this child is. Shout it out. It's a 14-year-old girl. And one more. Shout out, how old? 17-year-old girl. This is not merely the effects of malnutrition. These are the effects of a combination of severe neglect, of toxic stress on the negative side of the balance, and of the lack of nurture, care, and stimulation that every child needs and deserves. Our bodies react biologically to this kind of deprivation in dramatic ways, and particularly in orphanages. We see this a lot in the Central Eastern and Eastern European orphanages, but we've worked in dozens of countries around the world, and we've seen orphanages large and small and public and private. And we know and have seen the effects and have seen the studies showing the dramatic impact on children. Now travel with me to one more country, Vietnam. Hanoi, another large orphanage. There's a sea of cribs in front of you, and this time they're filled with babies, not older children. This is what you hear. Silence. These babies aren't crying, or hardly so. Babies are used to being picked up 100 times a day. They cry all day long when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, when they're sick, when they're just darn bored. And in the rice paddies around this orphanage in Vietnam, you would see poor mothers walking, cultivating their crops, and holding their babies and children. Even in subsistence poverty, the children were receiving the connection that they needed and that critical stimulation. But here, the babies shut down. Crying doesn't elicit a response because, once again, they're served on a routine. They're fed at a set time, and they're changed at a set time, and their world is the crib. Now imagine, these babies, their brains are tripling in size by the age of 2 or 3. Every day matters to these kids. These cribs are the foundation for the rest of their lives. And this is why we feel such a terrific urgency to get these babies out and into safe and nurturing families. Now, these issues have solutions. They're not purely theoretical, they're very practical. And Georgie's going to tell us about them.
As Philip said, some countries around the world have already started to try to solve this problem. It's a problem that the United States and many developed nations moved away from long ago, but you've probably heard less about countries like Sudan. In 2003, I was asked by UNICEF and some local civil society organizations to try and help them with the only baby institution in Khartoum, the country's capital. And at that stage, approximately 1,000 babies were left on the streets of Khartoum every year. These were predominantly newborns, born to young women outside marriage. These were young women who were terrified of their parents' response to their pregnancy, but were even more terrified of being punished under Sharia law. 100 lashes delivered in public. So they left the babies on the streets, and if you can imagine, the life expectancy of a baby on the streets of Khartoum is a few hours. Half the babies died there, and the other half would be admitted to the Mygoma baby orphanage, where the mortality rate was 82%. Babies were dying around us every single day. These babies were labeled as illegal, and they were deemed as guilty of their parents' sin. And because of this, there was very little investment in looking after them. There was no milk formula, there were no bottles, there was no sterilizing equipment. Newborn babies were being fed by pouring cups of cow's milk into their mouths. It was a miracle that any of the babies survived at all. But within a year, we had turned this round, and it was my absolute privilege to work together with government, with communities, with civil society, imams, doctors, journalists, human rights lawyers, police officers, and social workers. And together, we built an alternative family care program. Thousands of generous Sudanese families lined up to become emergency foster parents and adoptive families. And the mortality rate in the family program was less than 1%. Even the babies who came in a precarious state of health from the streets to the emergency families were flourishing. And this is because babies who otherwise would have lain in cots all day long in the institution were never out of the arms of their foster mothers and fathers, brothers, sisters, aunties, grannies. The extended family in Sudan came to the rescue. But in order to really solve the problem, we also knew that we had to focus on prevention, because otherwise Sudan would have needed an endless supply of foster parents, which is unsustainable in any country. So we worked quietly behind the scenes with religious leaders, and we built a communications program that changed societal attitudes to these babies and to their mothers. And within 3 years, we had achieved a reinterpretation of Sharia law that decriminalized being a single mother in Sudan. And because of this, it was possible to do prevention work in the community, and today there are more than 7,000 children who are living in their birth families or adoptive families in Sudan who would otherwise have been dead. And part of bringing this to scale and making it sustainable for the long term in a country like Sudan was ensuring that the government would finance it. So we worked with the government to identify a funding stream that could be sustainable for the long term. And the Islamic taxes that are collected from all Sudanese citizens were used to fund the emergency foster care program from 2004 onwards. In a country which over the last 14 years has suffered terrible continued civil war, eruptions of genocide, and a partition of the country, the government has managed to continue to sustain this alternative family care program and continues to do so for the future. So it is possible to solve this, but to solve it on a global scale, one of the key issues that we need to address is that so often, instead of funding the solution, we're funding the problem.
So I'm willing to bet that some of you in this room have supported an orphanage or are part of an organization that has, and if so, your heart is exactly where our heart is. You recognize the incredible vulnerability that these children stripped of family face in their communities. But we really need to understand what we're doing when we write that check. Are these orphanages for orphans? We've already heard from Shannon that 80 to 90% of the children in them are not orphans, and many of the rest have family. So they're not really orphanages. So are they to provide nutrition and shelter for the kids? Well, I know in this room we can think of 100 different ways to provide innovative nutrition and shelter and other support to families without removing kids from their communities and putting them in these orphanages. Okay, so maybe they're for children with disability? Oh no. Every expert and advocate working globally is going to tell you they want those kids, every kid, rich or poor, served in a family, a safe and nurturing family, through community-based programming. So what are we doing when we write these checks? Well, the thing is, I don't think we really know, but we dig deep. Lumos just finished a study in Haiti that showed that we're contributing $104 million annually to house 32,000 children in orphanages. That breaks down to over $3,000 per child in a country where the per capita national income is $800. There's something terribly wrong with that kind of resource allocation. Shannon, it's fueling a whole global industry, isn't it?
It is, Philip. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened. And the entire industry of orphanages has proliferated. And oftentimes, the industry itself is very corrupt. It provides a hotbed for human trafficking. We see children regularly trafficked through orphanages, oftentimes for child labor and child prostitution. Many orphanages actually employ people called baby finders. There are people who are paid to go out to the communities and actively recruit for new babies to come into the orphanages. They promise parents that the children will have access to education, access to health care that they wouldn't have at home with their parents who don't have the resources. They promise the parents that the children will be cared for, that they will be provided with much needed nutrition and shelter. They make all kinds of promises, and they aren't always true. In fact, many of these baby finders are paid a fee, so they actually get a recruitment fee for every child that they successfully bring into the orphanage. On the other hand, there are many of us who've been involved in orphanages at some point in our lives, thinking that we were doing the right thing, really truly with the best of intentions. Unfortunately, the mere presence of orphanages creates a pull factor from the communities. By establishing these orphanages, it provides something to the parents. It provides an opportunity for parents to place their children into these centers instead of keeping them at home. And it's not because the number of orphans is growing. It's because of our really good intentions gone wrong. The number of orphanages around the world has continued to proliferate. In Ghana alone, the number of orphanages rose from 10 in 1997 to 148 in 2006. This wasn't because there was suddenly a dramatic increase in the number of orphans living in Ghana. It wasn't because there was some outbreak that left thousands of children without their parents or that the poverty rate suddenly skyrocketed. Indeed, we see these kinds of figures happening all over the world in many, many countries. The majority of the orphanages that are being set up are foreign-owned. They're owned and operated by foreign actors, oftentimes those with the best of intentions, truly wanting to do something good for children and not understanding the irrevocable harm that they're causing. One of the saddest parts of the industry is something called voluntourism. It's the nexus of when people want to go overseas and they want to have a tourist experience, but they also want to feel good about that experience, right? So they want to volunteer. Many of our youth do this. It's not necessarily a bad thing, except that many of the volunteers, the top tourist destination for these volunteers are orphanages. The orphanages themselves receive a fee from each of the volunteers. So the volunteers come in and they provide some sort of service to the children. Because the volunteers are coming and there's a constant demand from the volunteers to go, the orphanages themselves are struggling to fill the supply. So they go out and they proactively recruit more children to come and fill the walls of the orphanage. The volunteers themselves go overseas, and even with the best of intentions, they plan to play with the children or teach the children English or hold the children and rock them. Unfortunately, it's creating more harm again. Now the children have not only been taken away from their families, taken away from their communities, and put behind these walls of the orphanage. Now they're experiencing the much-needed attention and love from these volunteers that they've been craving. But the volunteer only stays for a week, maybe two, and the volunteer leaves. And the children are subjected to an overwhelming sense of abandonment over and over and over again. It's a bleak picture. But amidst all this bleakness, we have good news. We do have a solution. And our solution, we know, has three major parts. One is really addressing this at the country level, the countries where we're working. The second is addressing this with the children and the families themselves. And the third is taking it global. Philip is an expert at setting up the national level systems.
Yes, Shannon, success is possible, and Rwanda is a great case. If you had been to Rwanda in 1994, you would have been hard-pressed to find a single orphanage. Rwandan families and communities took care of their own. But in 1994, the genocide occurred, and those communities were devastated. Dozens of orphanages sprung up across the country, housing thousands of children. Those children stayed until they became adults and exited, but do you think that the orphanages closed at that point? Of course not. They continued to take children in. The Rwandan Children's Parliament recognized this and said, we need to put a stop to putting children in these orphanages and causing them harm. And they called on the government to do something about it. And the government responded. It started a campaign. Let's raise them in families. And then it set a target that by 2020, it would place every single child in an orphanage in a safe and nurturing family. And united with partners, technical experts, NGOs, community-based organizations, faith-based leaders, to set up the whole program to make this work so that each individual child's needs were assessed and met, and families were prepared and supported, and then the placements were monitored. To date, they have placed 4 out of 5 children in safe and nurturing homes that are monitored in Rwanda. So with the support of the 100&Change grant, we're going to blow this out and make it global. We have identified 7 countries that couldn't be more different from one another. Their population sizes, all different regions of the world, their cultures, faith traditions, languages, the drivers of institutionalization, whether they be disability or refugee or health or poverty. They're all vastly different. But they have one thing in common: political will. We know from our work in each of these countries that they are ripe for change. In fact, they're demanding it at the political level, but they need help. Each of these countries has sent a strong letter of support for the Changing the Way We Care program. They're ready to participate. Now, we're going to do 3 things in each of these countries at the national level. First, we're going to translate that political will into a movement of government and its partners built around advocacy that changes minds and that convinces people on the ground and in their communities of the importance of families and keeping those families strong. The second thing we're going to do is translate that movement into public policy to make sure that public and private actors are laser focused on deinstitutionalizing their systems. And the third thing we're going to do is to translate that public policy into a system. The programs and the services and the trained professionals that are needed to safely assess these children and to safely place them and to continue to support and monitor those families. Now, in philanthropy lexicon, this is something like a design-build process. It's crafted for each and every country and its circumstances. But it's not a project. As the Indonesian government said in its letter of support, we're looking for an entire change of paradigm. And it's this change in paradigm that's going to affect the lives of children on the ground. Isn't it, Shannon?
The basis of what we want to do is support families. We want to strengthen families. We want to reunite children who are currently in orphanages to go back home, to be with their families, to be in safe and protective environments. But we also want to prevent any new children from entering into orphanages and ever facing these devastating consequences. So how do we do it? We work with the national governments, like Philip said, and we set up systems that are able to provide those services to the children and the families themselves. We really focus on something called case management. We provide intensive support to the families themselves. We monitor the children. We make sure that the children's placement is in their best interests. We have people who go out, they spend time with the families, they get to know the children, and they monitor them over time to make sure they continue to be safe and protected. We also provide support for the communities themselves. We know that many of the communities need support to make sure that whatever they have at the community level is inclusive for all children. So we work with the communities to actually make sure that the education systems themselves are inclusive, that teachers are trained in how to respond to children's needs and how to be responsive to all the needs of the children within their community. We work with health workers also to train them on how to respond to the children from their communities. We also work with the communities to address stigma and discrimination, like George mentioned earlier in Sudan, making sure that any of those underlying issues that are leading to an increase in institutionalization of children is addressed so that we can prevent future placements. We also work intensively with the families themselves. So we provide ongoing support to the families to ensure that they have parenting support, they have training. When a family is welcoming a child back home from an orphanage, we work with them to make sure that they know how to respond to the needs of their children within the household, how to respond to the trauma, how to respond to the reintegration. We link parents up together so that they have support amongst one another. We also provide basic economic strengthening activities and support. So whether that is linking families up with cash transfer programs that the government's supporting, whether that is providing access to smaller scale savings groups, or providing literacy training for the family so that they can better use their resources. We are there walking alongside the families to make sure that they have the support that they need. We're doing this right now, community by community, but it's time to take it global.
Everything that we develop in each of the countries, as we transform systems and build them in each of the 7 countries, we will use the learning to spread across 7 regions. For example, in Moldova, I know that that slide doesn't quite work with what I'm just going to say, but briefly, in Moldova, we've helped the government over 10 years to reduce the number of children in institutions by nearly 90%. And that learning is currently being used to help the Russian government and the Ukrainian government develop their plans for change. They have asked to learn from what happened in Moldova, and that is developing change programs for more than 500,000 children currently languishing in the sorts of orphanages that Philip showed you earlier. Our program in Haiti together is going to work to demonstrate how it is possible in a country with quite weak governance and with extreme poverty, and that is continuously lashed by political change and also by terrible, devastating environmental and weather incidents such as hurricanes and earthquakes. We are going to show how it's possible in a country like that to build a stable system to protect children. And most importantly, we are going to help to shift the money. That 100 million currently going into Haiti to fund 30,000 children in orphanages, but which is actually most of that money going into the pockets of traffickers, will be diverted and will be used to help 340,000 children to live in families, be in schools, and have the possibility to develop to their full potential. Each of the countries' programs will teach the other countries around it and will help us to build regional movements that we use to put pressure on the global decision makers so that changing the way we care becomes a priority, a top priority for sustainable development for the planet. At the same time, a global communications program will be educating people across the world, societies across the world, on the harm caused by orphanages, because so few people know how harmful they are, but also showing how the real change for children lies within families and in communities themselves. And we will work with donors across the world, from the Volunteer giving $500 to the European Union giving $5 billion a year in global aid. We will ensure that money currently spent in orphanages is shifted across to the community-based services, health, education, and social protection that the most vulnerable children and families need. And all of this will be led and informed by children themselves. As one young girl said to me recently, who was in an institution but then had the luck to be moved to a foster family, she said, "We need to stop investing in buildings and start investing in families. Because when you invest in families, it's like investing in the blacksmith who forges the suit of armor that children need, which is love." Governments, communities, donors, professionals, families, and especially children themselves. Together, we will create an unstoppable global movement for change.
Stephen and Victoria are not alone. 8 million Stephens and Victorias are out there. I'm happy to let you know that today, Stephen is a thriving adult. Thanks to a social worker who took a special interest in him and his own resilience, he was able to go on to university. He graduated from university in the Netherlands, realized that he didn't know where home was and decided to make it his life's work to speak on behalf of other children like himself, to ensure that all children had access to a family. He went back to Kenya. He created the Kenya Care Leavers Society, a group of adults who have left care after participating in orphanage care as a child. He's also a global advocate for children's issues. Victoria was able to return back home when her school and her community became inclusive. She's 20 years old today. She graduated from high school 2 years ago, and now she volunteers with her local school. She's also an advocate with the Lumos Youth Advisory Board, and she also joined us along with a larger group of youth advocates from Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and Moldova in May to inform our project and provide advice and recommendations to changing the way we care. I'm extremely honored to let you know that Stephen and Victoria are both here with us today. I hope you'll take advantage of our breakout session this afternoon where they will be our feature and be happy to speak to you. They're very much looking forward to sharing their stories. There are 8 million Stephens and Victorias out there, 8 million children waiting to become thriving adults. That's the ripple effect of actually investing in families, not casting them aside, of valuing our children, not forgetting about them, of funding the solution and not the problem. We know the problem, and we have the solution. And together, we have the experience, the expertise, and the passion to change the way the world cares for children. And it all starts now.
The change begins with you.
You will change the lives of millions of children forever.
Join us in changing the way we care.
Thank you.
All right, thank you to Changing the Way We Care. So how exactly do you solve a problem? One where the need is so obvious, so urgent, but it seems intractable. As we've seen, there's no one answer, but there are answers, and that there are actually solutions out there that you can invest in. Solutions that we can scale, solutions that we can make possible. After those 4 presentations, I'm a little more inspired, and I'm a little more hopeful as a jaded journalist. As an enemy of the people. And I'm grateful, grateful for the hard work and dedication of all who've participated in the 100&Change competition. And that's especially true of the 4 presentations. They have been working on these presentations since they became finalists. These 4 bold solutions that inspired us all. They're not finished quite yet. After lunch, we break into smaller groups. As a reminder, your schedule is on the personalized program that you received at registration. There will be breakout sessions with each of our finalists, giving you the opportunity to explore a little more, to learn from them on a more personal level. We will close the day with a reception where we can all connect, share our thoughts, and celebrate the optimism and inspiration of this day. Then, on Wednesday, December 20th, MacArthur plans to announce the winner of its $100 million grant. But this work won't end with one grant or a single winner. There are hundreds of projects that are ready to go, ready to be funded. Today is just the beginning. So thank you all very much.